Hi everyone, it's Brandy Vanderheiden, and this is an interview that I did with Dr. Daniel Foor, who wrote the book Ancestral Healing. And I think if you're a trauma therapist or if you're doing your own healing work or both, you're really going to get a lot out of this, learning about ancestors and cultural healing and so many more things. So enjoy. So I'm so glad you're here. This is really a thing that we've wanted to do for a while and figure out like the intersection of our work. And I think I've known you for like 13 years now, and I'm actually pretty familiar with your work. So I think it'll be fun to dive in. And so you're here actually giving talks about your book. So we'll do the flashy, here's your book shot, Ancestral Medicine, Rituals for Personal and Family Healing. And tell us a little bit about your book. I mean, it's exciting.
Yeah, thanks, Brandy. It's good to be here. And the book was published this summer, July of 2017, this past summer. And it's the culmination of over a decade of focused ritual work, especially with blood lineage ancestors. And the book is intended as a fairly comprehensive guidebook to the foundations or basics of ancestor ritual and reverence, especially for folks who were not raised with that kind of framework, which is most people in modern and Western cultures. And the practice of relating directly and ritually with my own ancestors in spirit over the last 2 decades has been very healing and grounding and empowering for me. And I wanted to share that work. So the material in the book arises out of teaching others to reconnect with their ancestors since 2004, 2005, and trainings are around the country, a lot of session work. And so I wrote it as a guidebook, and I tried to write it in a way that's culturally inclusive to people of diverse backgrounds and different types of ancestral experience, and sensitive to the history of colonialism and genocide and all other kinds of ways that people can become disconnected from their own heritage. And I tried to write it in a way that's encouraging to folks who feel a lot of pain and disconnect and hurt around their family of origin. So, yeah, it's a practical, non-dogmatic, inclusive guidebook for reclaiming a framework to relate directly with your own ancestors in spirit, both the remembered ones and the much older ones who were pre-colonialism and lived before a lot of the recent cycle of cultural trouble.
And yeah, I think that's an important thing that I've learned. And I think that I'm really a good example of somebody who came completely blind into your work 13 years ago and you know, had a lot of resistance. And it was, you know, because you lived in the area, it was easy for me to really titrate my engagement. And so I just want to encourage people who are out there going, I don't know, what is all of this? You know, to just sort of step into the stream somewhere and see.
For sure. Just to speak to it right off, sometimes when people in the West think of their ancestors, they tend to think of the recent dead, the ones who are remembered because you interacted with them or because they're remembered by name or by recent history, or they're thinking of just individuals. And what's important is that a lot of traditional frameworks for ancestor reverence think of the ancestors also as lineages or groups of ancestors, and as not just the recent ones, but also those who lived before remembered names. And so even if you know that your ancestors acted in very harmful ways, or you don't know anything about them, and so there's a quality of cutoff or of disappointment or even trauma that is associated with your experience of your recent people, what's important is to not let that recent strata of your ancestry fully define the bigger topic of ancestry. Because to do that is to project your experience of your parents or of the last few generations onto thousands of years of history. And so even a colonizer, a settler, upper middle class, European ancestor people who have related very poorly with people of color still have older ancestors who lived before those kinds of troubles began in Europe and then got exported to the rest of the world. And it's possible for European ancestor people to connect with those much older ancestors in a way that's culturally healing and empowering as well.
It's really hard, I think, from my perspective, to even imagine what it would look like to have lived back then, and how our people interacted.
Real generally speaking, indigenous, tribal, animistic folks who live in relatively smaller communities, at least compared to modern cities, by necessity are more in tune with the different rhythms and movements of the natural world or the other than human world, and tend to have a more relational and respectful way of viewing the rest of life. And that framework of ancestor reverence and reverence for the other than human worlds was broken down in our European lineages from the period of maybe 200 current era until 800, 1000 current era, with the expansion of Roman Empire and then Christian, the Holy Roman Empire. And so there's a lot of internalized, internal trauma in Europe, a lot of white-on-white crime, as it were, and that trauma then gets exported in the last 500-600 years in the form of genocidal behavior toward Native peoples and African peoples, and so then we have our current cultural mess that we're in. And it's important to be able to track that trauma story back to a time where in Europe people were no longer living in relationship with the rest of life, and so there's a conceptual disconnect from the realm of spirit, from dialogue with the rest of the natural world.
And that's part of what you see is how we could heal the current mess.
I do. I see it as one important part of it. And if white people or European ancestor people only go so far as to say, wow, ancestrally we've been behaving badly, and then feel like garbage about ourselves and stop there, that's not particularly transformative. There's an invitation to dig deeper and be like, so aside from one's personal trauma, where are the cultural roots of the trauma? Where did it begin? Because the resonance that open-hearted white people might feel with, let's say, Native North American people who are being in an ongoing way related with poorly by the government, by mining companies, whatever it is. And so there's a sense of affinity for like, no, don't mess with indigenous people, and that's great. It's great to be supportive allies in those causes. And what it does is it resonates and lights up our own older ancestral trauma about the times when our Germanic or British Isles or ancestrally Polish or Italian, whatever it is, ancestors got related with poorly. And there was a disconnect from tribal sensibilities because of empire within Europe. And so it's true, I do a lot of work of helping people of whatever background to connect with their ancestors in spirit who dwell in the present as allies, to then heal up the lineages between those older ancestors in the present. And from that place of being more healed, our ancestors can help us in the decolonizing, cultural healing work of the times. And of course, in our personal and family healing work. So, yeah.
And what you named was a sense of feeling more grounded and connected. What I'm thinking about is, experiences where, I've been at workshops and you have people that are like, yeah, my grandfather came through and said this and that. And,
right.
And then there's the folks who are like, I don't see anything, I don't healing. How can I feel that sense of connection? Is that
how we relate directly with the ancestors or with other than human beings, like the collective intelligence of animals and plants or stones, rivers, requires reclaiming a capacity that I see as innate, but which has been undernourished or outright damaged from the history of colonialism and religious intolerance that judges the other than humans and says they're not actually people, they're not actually beings worthy of relating with, or they don't exist, or things like that. And so just to begin to speak to our own ancestors directly, or to greet the land, or to speak to the trees, or to relate even with our domesticated animal companions as intelligent beings, breaks a kind of cultural agreement. And it starts to disrupt the conditioning from colonialism, and starts to affirm to ourselves that these actually are other people. They might not be human people, their bodies might not be shaped like ours, they might not be visibly perceivable, but they have a kind of reality just as we do. And because of that, there's ethical and moral accountability that we have toward them. So you can't just bulldoze a mountain or fill in a stream or desecrate the bones in a cemetery without ethical repercussion. And so just beginning to speak to the others is one simple practice. Another is tracking our dreams closely and allowing for that kind of contact. Another is participating in whatever kind of ritual or ceremony or traditions that work for people that set up the conditions for a safe encounter with those others. And another is to track synchronicity, or events that happen throughout your day that are unlikely and that are accompanied by a feeling of contact with the others. And so the sense is to be tenacious about it, to know that any given individual's pathway of connecting with the spirits or the more than human worlds is going to look a little different. But if people are tenacious, they'll find ways to allow for that, those new skills to be cultivated.
And it really is hard to have that kind of tenacity when you're on your own.
Sure.
And I remember you talking about the Bay Area, in particular, the San Francisco Bay Area, and how difficult you found it here to cultivate community based on many different factors. And
it's true. And this is a pretty progressive place as culture goes.
Right.
And the more, even finding just one ally in the work can be helpful. Mm-hmm. And to remember that what seems strange in this culture is actually quite normal in other places. For more tribally or animistically, indigenously intact cultures and places on Earth, to not dialogue with the land and the ancestors looks odd. Like the norm here is seen as pathology in other places. And so choosing to learn and study about the way that other people see the world can be helpful. I have intended to bring that spirit in the book, that talking to the dead, relating with the earth, relating with the wind and trees, is actually quite normal. It's not spiritual. It doesn't make you special. You don't have to be called to do it any more than you have to be called to, like, I don't know, it's very basic. It's very mm-hmm. normal. Yeah. And so that's, that feels important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it kind of takes away from the, like, yeah, but I want that specialness feeling.
Well, sure. I mean, that's our own insecurity. It's just needing to be special is directly proportional to our private low self-esteem that we nourish. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes folks' bad feeling about themselves is a function of ancestral low self-esteem. There's a strong tendency in psychology, and I'm saying this as a marriage and family therapist with a PhD in psychology and a lot of respect for the field, there can be a tendency to frame one's struggles as just individual. And that's problematic, because then there's a layer of shame on top of it, and it's also not very accurate a lot of times, that one's problems kind of just came out of nowhere. So a field like marriage and family therapy might frame it as family level. So that's a bit better. You're looking at it on a systemic level, but still it's basically like your family of origin, or the system that you're embedded in. Social work, has a similar tendency to see it as more systemic. But what I'm suggesting is that Western culture in general tends to only extend personhood or validity to other living humans, and not even all of them, based on the history and ongoing reality of racism, sexism, etc. So people get seen as less than human in all kinds of sneaky ways. But definitely there's a tendency in Western psychology to not validate the collective intelligence of animals and plants and ancestors and deities and all these other kinds of people, right? And so systemically, if we take a real systemic approach, these others have an important role to play as well. And in that sense, almost all psychological trouble that one would bring to therapy is cultural wounding. It's all cultural trouble, in a sense. And that's good news because it means that we're inherently deeply connected and that our suffering is not meaningless and in isolation. It's a function of this larger system that has problems. Yeah. And there are bigger cultural level remedies for the cultural level wounding that we can draw on.
Yeah, I think there's so much that's out there and that's emerging in this time, at least, you know, in the circles that come to me in my Facebook feed, right?
Sure.
But, you know, in the somatic world of trauma healing, somatic experiencing, we share that belief, but we haven't gone as far as you have, obviously. There's deep embedded in our training is like the farther back you go in the stream, with the healing, the more you're going to impact the person's life going forward. And so, you know, we have trauma people who will just go back to an event, and then we're going back and saying, well, what about childhood? Well, what about birth? Well, what about conception? And so now we're going back, you know, intergenerational.
Where did it begin? What about Charlemagne moving into Central Europe and humiliating the men who are trying to protect their families from invading Holy Roman forces and are forced to witness the violation of their culture and their sacred spaces and have Christianity imposed upon them by force? How does that ancestral humiliation reverberate in the bones? And how does it show up in 2018 in the way we're trying to do intimate relationships with our partners when it hasn't been addressed? It's just been left to fester. And so there's a great resource I want to mention by Resma Menaken, I believe I'm saying his name right, called My Grandmother's Hands. And he is coming from a background of a somatic-oriented therapist who is looking at racial trauma and white supremacy, or white body supremacy, as he would say, in the West, and how European, and is looking at the epidemic of police brutality that skews so strongly toward African American people. And how do we get at the murdering of African American people by bringing a therapist's sensibility to that kind of trauma that continues to repeat? And one of the things that he's bringing forward is that the trauma that is been transferred into the bodies of people of color is essentially a trauma that begins with European culture for the most part and is then forcibly transferred out in the way that when we avoid our own healing, we tend to enact pain and create fresh trauma for others. And it's a very unskillful way of like bringing it to the surface, that creates more problems. And so how do European ancestred people become accountable to that pattern so that it can be interrupted and healed? And how do people of color have a appreciation for where the trauma that they've internalized sources from so that their self-esteem is not adversely impacted by thinking it's a shortcoming on their part? And everybody in that system get in touch with a strata of their own ancestry and identity that's not defined by the genocide of the last 500 years that's played out.
It's there's no simple solution, obviously. And I always like to come back to the practical and the here and now. You know, there are big challenges in probably all psychology trainings with who shows up as usually white European ancestor folks.
Sure.
Probably middle-aged and usually female.
Sure.
And so to tackle the question of like inclusion and diversity, it has been, something that has been getting raised more and more often, thank goodness.
Good.
But it's still like, well, what do we do right now? People are coming in or they're not coming in based on the experiences of being met or not being met.
Right. I think there are things that psychology folks who are in positions to train others can do to foreground issues of cultural healing and inclusivity that in turn bring more diverse folks into the field. And recognizing that the psychological wounding that is dealt with in a therapy setting is not separable from the cultural wounding that we're trying to work out. Somatic-oriented psychology, I think, has an important role to play, whether it's somatic experiencing or Hakomi or things like that. And it's interesting how somatics intersects the world of ritual and ceremony that I'm immersed in, because on the one hand, the tendency to be a bit body dissociated and sex negative and not just embodied in our sensuality and our physicality is a cultural wound that warrants a strong correction by emphasizing body intelligence and somatic awareness and all that. So that's a very empowering corrective to a cultural kind of trouble. And at the same time, the blind spot that invalidates or fails to even consider the reality of the spirits means that people are going to tend, when they're like, oh, I need to get really in my body and own this and claim this, they're going to tend to identify unhelpful spirit influence as part of their own experience. So someone's father has died or grandmother's died, and they're in a ghost condition. They're not well in spirit. And they're continuing to draw on that person's energy because they haven't transitioned. So they're still around. And someone has only a somatic, I'm going to own this and really explore it and internalize it framework. They're going to take this not them energy on a spirit level and further the intrusive relationship with that energy in a way that is unhelpful. Another way of saying it is like, as soon as you recognize that the spirits exist, it's important to have a strong culture of consent around how you're relating with them as well, not just with other living humans. And so somatic work, as I see it, requires also a very strong emphasis on healthy boundaries and recognizing what's you and what's not you. And recognizing that on a subtle energy level or a spirit level, there can be things that are not you, that if you tune into your body and you remember to ask that question, you're like, oh, this actually isn't me. This needs, for the somatic wellness of who I am, to be outside my field. And so you disidentify with it rather than internalize it.
Yeah, and that is, I mean, boundaries is really somatic work.
For sure, yeah.
And differentiation is really part of, a big part of what we do in somatic experiencing. And, you know, you're trying to get so many different levels of differentiation going, because that's what forms a boundary, right? It's not this thing, it's two things. And it seems to me like that's a very subtle level of differentiation for people that aren't even aware, like, oh, I can actually, now that you mention it, I can feel something there.
Right.
To, oh yeah, this is not good spirit energy. That seems like a difficult thing to differentiate.
In a sense, it's subtle, but it also just depends on your cultural frame. Like if someone came in because they had neck pain to like a doctor visit, and there was a giant like vampire bat stuck to their neck and their face, and the doctor's like, I don't know, we can run some tests, I'm not sure what it is, but failed to speak to the big creature stuck to their neck, it would be a failure on the part of that medical professional to be like, it could be the giant creature stuck to your face that is causing the discomfort. And so with respect to an animist or a more spirit-oriented way of viewing things, that self-other recognition is critically important. A lot of how traditionalists around the world, you could say shamans or people like them, like traditional doctoring people, will view distress or symptomatic behavior that results in someone going to see them. They'll see it as embedded in the relational field rather than just in the individual. So they're like, what about this individual's relationships with their ancestors, with their living family, with their destiny, with the earth, with the spirits of the natural world is out of balance. So how do we restore balance in the relational field so that this individual is no longer symptomatic?
Yeah, and I think that, you know, at least in psychotherapy training, it's all about my personal experience and training in something is going to inform how I work with a client, of
Sure.
course. And so, you know, if I'm not able to differentiate it, I'm not going to be able to highlight that for the person.
Sure.
There are people that come into the office all the time and are like, I have regular communication with my deceased mother or whoever it is.
Right.
And, you know, how I approach it is I just go right along with them.
Right.
I don't judge it or try to make it different or anything like that. Like, what can we learn from this experience?
Right.
But in terms of, you know, is that person healthy or not healthy? Are they leeching off this person? Those are questions that I think,
Yeah.
as long as I've been studying with you, I still would be like, I don't know.
Sure. It requires, I suppose, its own kind of proficiency. It's been satisfying for me to begin to really train others in earnest. I've made that transition in the last year or two of my practice to focus only on training other people on how to guide this work, many of whom are therapists. And so I see it as just a basic cultural competency, in a sense, to know how to also include elements of ritual. And for the APA, it's a stretch. But the APA has a unconsciously racist view toward humans by having the view that only Native people, for example, might see a traditional healer. When I did my doctoral research a decade ago, the guidelines for the APA were that, if you're seeing a Native American person, you might refer them to a traditional healer if they need that. Okay, so that's a good start. But what I would add is that what if the traditional healer is also a therapist? Can that person provide both kinds of services at the same time? And we navigate all kinds of other multiple relationships in the field, especially in small communities. And then the other question is it really true that only Native Americans have a animist or spirit-oriented view toward life? It is not true.
Right.
And what if your waspy white client wants to work their healing process in that way? What if you're seeing an African American client who has a view toward reality in that way? And what if they're open to seeing anyone who gets good results, whether it's someone who's also African American by ancestry or someone who just has a similar worldview? And so more and more there are people who are open to a more spiritual frame on their own healing process. And I think a whole lot of people are like, whatever works, I don't really care. I just want to suffer less. So if we need to talk to my ancestors to do that, great, let's do it. So.
Well, what I like is your non-dogmatic approach and that there are lots of different ways in. I think one of the interests that I had when we first met was the spirit guide aspect or
Right.
Totem animals. Like that was safer for me.
Right.
And then over time, was more willing to explore different pieces. And for someone else, like ancestors might be the way in or something.
Sure.
So there's something for everyone in it. We don't have to go straight to the complicated. It's like
Right.
the simple day-to-day kinds of things. So what are some of the simple things that therapists and people working toward their healing can start with?
Well, the first big thing is to try on the paradigm or the framework that other living humans are only one source of meaningful, intimate relationship. That we can also have meaningful, intimate, connective, nourishing relationship where we feel seen and held and loved and mirrored with those who are no longer physically incarnate, with the ancestors, and with the other than human worlds, with the land, the elements, the mountains, trees, etc. And so just beginning to speak to them and open to that possibility creates a whole another field of possible relationships for having a win around one's attachment. So you can have a better likely outcome of a secure attachment or a kind of earned attachment in relating with the earth and the stability of the deity that is this planet, or with loving and kind ancestors. So insofar as people are wanting to heal up relational trauma or complex trauma from childhood and a really miserable childhood, you want to go to other kinds of beings that are likely to be stable and provide an emotional win, right? An emotionally corrective kind of experience. And so these other than humans can definitely function in that way as a source of relational healing. And as you were saying, people ideally follow what has energy for them. If it's dream work, do that. If it's being out in the natural world, do that. If it's ancestral repair and reconnection, do that. But do something. Find a way in, follow your energy with that, and let it be joyful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You know, a couple of the things that I've done with you in the past has been being out in nature. And, you know, my experience, you know, growing up was very minimal engagement with nature.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, over the past 10 years, living in the Bay Area makes it really easy to get out into the woods.
Mm-hmm.
And yet there's this feeling when you're on trails that are, you know, so populated,
Mm-hmm.
that it's like there's a race
Mm-hmm.
on the trails. And, you know, I have gratitude for my partner who's very oriented to nature, and
Mm-hmm.
along the way has, you know, like, we go slow and we stop and look at stuff. And
Right.
the work that we did, though, was being in a group and just finding a little clearing and sitting there
Mm-hmm.
and actually taking it in on that level. And
Yeah.
it's really a lot different.
Yeah. Speaking to the other than humans is a start, and then the next thing is listening for their response back, and actually starting to have conversations where the spirits or the beings who have different shaped bodies are seeing you and responding to you and giving you specific messages. And we've been conditioned in this culture to associate that with psychosis, but it's almost never that.
Mm.
From another perspective, it's psychotic in a sense to have the view that we're the only sentient kind of thing around, and that white cisgendered men are the apex of human culture. So that kind of conditioning from sexism and white supremacy that's still unconsciously very prevalent in this culture is the source of a lot of our psychological illness and suffering. And in a sense, Western culture is what you're treating in therapy,
Mm-hmm.
and is the source of the illness.
Have you read Chellis Glendenning's book?
I've heard of it,
Yeah.
but I think the title speaks to it, yeah.
There's a beloved person in the SE community, Twig Wheeler, who has
Mm-hmm.
recommended that book for years, and I think has really laid a lot of groundwork for people that were trained at my time of, like, that this is
Mm-hmm.
problematic, and that even living in this large of a group is really not in our genetic history
Mm-hmm.
of experience.
Right.
Because I don't know where he found this, but that our nervous systems are able to track about 150 people.
Right.
And once you start to get beyond that, there's a low level of sympathetic arousal that's
Mm-hmm.
constantly happening.
Sure.
And most of
see
us in this culture don't live that way.
Right. It's true. The culture has a lot of, you could say, elemental fire, and a lot of accelerated energy that is hard on the body and hard on our psyches. Certainly true with technology. I know I struggle with that some too. And you get above 150 friends on your Facebook, and it's anxiety, right? But the act of slowing down and coming into relationship with the others is a radical kind of act. It's a decolonizing, and it's a reclaiming of our connectedness, and it's a good antidote to the anxiety and isolation that a lot of folks feel. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
One of my actual specializations is in early developmental trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, it's very clear, especially when you look through this framework, you know, how, you know, we came into a situation that our parents were victims to as well. And so there's a lot of, like, you know, this is what they were experiencing, and so of course you came in this way, and
Mm-hmm.
that's what their parents were experiencing, and sort of going back. But what you were saying before, I think that just coming back for the folks in the community who are also looking at pre-perinatal trauma in that era, is that sometimes when you're relating with ancestors in this way, you notice that the attachment wounds will surface naturally in like, okay, I'm trying to connect with my grandparents and they're not listening. Nobody's there.
Right.
It's a little bit of a trauma reenactment.
Of course, yeah.
And yeah, and so, you know, I think from my perspective, what I would say to a client is, if they're on the side where they can grok this, is like, you know, kind of expect that, but know that it's from then, and it's not necessarily about now.
It's important, as it is with living humans, to have a lot of discernment about the condition of the dead. Just dying doesn't make you wise and loving and kind. I don't think it's smart at all to just relate with your ancestors as a monolithic, safe, happy, love and light community, because many of our dead are not at peace yet, because culturally we haven't tended to take care of that. I invite people to work with a 1 to 10 scale of wellness, and the 1 to 3 range is the toxic, really not good at all, fragmented or intrusive, harmful demographic among the dead, and often because they were in that condition during life as well. And 4 to 6 range are the regular ghosts, the intact but not yet well-seated, not yet deeply at peace ones among the dead. And the 7 to 10 range would be the true ancestors, the ones that are safe to be around. They'd be safe in your room at night when you're sleeping. They'd be safe around your kids, if you have kids. And so we want all of our ancestors to be in that condition of wellness, but they're not automatically, especially if folks haven't ritually given any care and thought to their well-being. And so I don't advise people to just call out to their ancestors. Sometimes people call out to their recently deceased people, and it doesn't go that well, or it feels like a source of heaviness because the dead themselves are not well. Sometimes the living are actually making connection with an unwell energy, and what's needed instead is a boundary and a framework that supports connecting with those among the dead who are well, and having real discernment about the ghosts or the not yet well dead. And so just same like with the living. You wouldn't have a wedding and invite 100 people from the phone book. You would want to choose people you know to be well, or people you want there. And so it's the same with how we approach relating with the ancestors. There's a real profound need for discernment about who we're calling in.
And I think that the tricky part of it is that when you're starting to relate to people that you haven't heard stories about, you don't know anything about, it's like, how do I connect with you? Why would I think that you would care about me?
Right.
Because the ones that I've known or the ones who are here don't.
Right. Which is a projection of your experience of the recent ones onto the older ones. And the ancestors, we have a kind of unshakable connection with them through the mysteries of blood and of the body. And the approach that I take is lineage-based. So I'm inviting people to relate with communities or collective groups or currents of energy or groups of souls among the dead, rather than individuals. So in a sense, it's almost not, it's not just a personal, we care about you specifically thing. It's a sense that the living person is the face or the continuation of the story of a lineage. And in that sense, it's like them caring about themselves, or the finger cares about the hand. There's a sense of, or vice versa. And so there's a sense that they don't see us as separate from them on a lineage level. And so it's not a stretch for them to be invested in our well-being once we see the underlying nature that's of inseparable connection. Yeah.
And so do you think that it's more helpful in healing the lineage for the person to focus on themselves in their lived experience, or to work with their ancestors?
It's my habit to focus, to encourage the living folks that do this work to safely and systematically heal up their own lineages, and the psychological and health benefits that come as a result of that are really welcome, beneficial byproducts. And so rather than, it's like you go upstream and address the sources of toxins that are in the water, and the water quality downstream just follows from that. So I suppose you could say it's a kind of service-oriented work, like you're cleaning up a system that you're down lineage from, in order, because it's the right thing to do, perhaps because you want to see the benefits personally, and they tend to come. But the focus really is on making sure the system is well, and then harvesting or noticing the psychological byproduct of that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Do you think you can be more specific about what those benefits are? Because I think that it's like that if there's a promise of payout.
Sure. And I don't like to overclaim a thing or to try to be selling something, but when our lineages are well, we tend to enjoy better health, tend to enjoy better luck or fortune, tend to be more protected from vectors of like ancestral karma or trouble, like repeating. Yeah, there's a kind of protection that comes with it. Another benefit is greater clarity about one's specific destiny and unique gifts and talents in the world, because we don't get a lot of support around identifying our specific path or mission, if you will, here. The ancestor is very helpful around that. The healing with the ancestors tends to lead to a sense of greater belonging, and so that bone level sense of security and healthy self-esteem, and less loneliness, more of a source that there are forces that have your back, and a greater appreciation for what's good about family, while also being able to have healthy boundaries with living family. If you find yourself caring for living family, like parents who are elderly, let's say, the ancestors can assist them, like ritually and spiritually, help to shoulder some of that weight or burden. And the ancestors are great allies in parenting and helping us to also identify what our children need. So cultural belonging and clarity about path, good health, good fortune.
Those all sound like really helpful things.
Yeah, I don't mean to overstate it, but having stepped a few thousand people in the last 10, 15 years through this work, I do feel like that's fair to say that those are benefits.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
And I did put out a question to the SE community about what they would like to know.
Mm-hmm.
And so I have a couple of people who want to ask some questions here.
Great.
Let's see. So this comes from Raquel, who's actually in Australia.
Great.
She says, I'm curious about this. If we identify an ancestral pattern, what parts of our lineage do we need to focus our healing? Can we heal a family pattern by primarily focusing on our ancestors? Can we heal a family pattern by primarily focusing on the way it has expressed through us? Do we need to heal our ancestors to heal an intergenerational pattern? So I think a lot of that you covered, but if there's anything else.
It's a good question, and I don't like to create new dogma. I don't want to say that people need to work with my approach to things, but the way the approach I've developed would speak to that is you want to understand the root of that trouble and to connect with the ancestors who lived before that trouble and ask those older ones to hold a container or a process for the healing of the ancestors who lived out that trouble and who may still be in it in spirit. So making sure the ancestors themselves are well is part of the fix. And once that's happened, you can then ask to also have the way that that trouble or that inheritance lives in you be cleared or transformed or healed up, so that you, the ancestors before you, and the much older ones who were never touched by that trouble have a sense of continuity and unbroken connectedness. So if you heal the part of the ancestral system that's still holding that pattern, it makes it much easier to personally transform it in a lasting way. And another important principle here is understanding what's the obscured blessing that the burden or the trouble is blocking. And so bringing out the gift or the positive quality that needs strengthened is another way of transforming the burden. And so if you can identify what that is, then that's, because you can't really replace something with nothing very easily. So if the something is the trouble, there needs to be an even bigger, more magical and potent something that is the antidote or the remedy. And that can be framed as the ancestral blessing. So what are the gifts we need to be embodying? And I tend to look at things and I invite people to work with 4 primary bloodlines of think of your 4 biological grandparents and the lineage of women before your grandmothers and the lineage of men before your grandfathers. And using that language, I don't mean to assume so much about certainly not making assumptions about the sexual orientation or gender identity or lifestyle or whatever of any of those particular people that we descend from. In a sense, I'm looking at sperm and egg and the kind of bloodline in that way. So people who are not trans, queer, not gender conforming, know that I'm not holding that in a rigid way.
And also people who've been adopted.
Sure. Then for adoptees, the sense is to still honor ancestors of blood and how adoptees want to relate with adoptive family is really up to them. It could be that they hold them in the same gravitas and connectivity as blood ancestry, or it could be that they honor adoptive family, but they don't feel as connected to them. So it really is up to each individual to navigate what level of weight they would want to give to adoptive family, ritually speaking.
I imagine that the lineage also has choice about whether or not they see you as connected or not.
It's true to a degree, and if you've been raised by a lineage, I think it's fair to go to them and be like, demand inclusion nicely, and to speak up for that. It's okay to place demands on our ancestors and to be respectfully bossy and insistent with them. Yeah. There's room for that in spiritual stuff. Like, you don't have to be polite or restrained. You can freak out a little bit. It can be useful.
Yeah, because I think people, because this is new to so many of us, they maybe came from a religious background where it's a supplicant kind of
Yeah, no, it's not like that exactly. The ancestors are kind of wild and colorful and have a lot of personality often. And they're not as restrained. They're not as conservative in their expression. They tend to have all different kinds of animated, magical qualities. Yeah.
And all of the process that you just described is pretty clear in the book with exercises.
It is in the book. If people want to connect with this type of thing, I wrote the book as a guidebook. So for the folks who are motivated or cautious and want to just read about it, it's all in the book. I also encourage people to connect with the practitioners that have trained in the work, some of whom are therapists or some of whom have a background in somatic experiencing and things like it. And so connecting with the practitioner, even by distance sessions, totally fine. A lot of people do Skype or Zoom or video phone sessions. And I still do some in-person trainings, although I've migrated more toward mentoring folks who are drawn to learn how to guide this work for others. And I have an online course that I've developed. Finally, after years, I decided to give that a try to be able to reach more people.
That's great.
So,
and you also have a ton of videos and things like that, interviews that you've done, right?
It's true. And all that's free. It's on my website. It's ancestralmedicine.org. And I'm passionate about reintroducing into modern Western culture a framework for relating well with the other than humans, with the ancestors, with this wider field of being. Because a lot of folks, including a lot of European ancestor people, are drawn to what we would think of as indigenous or shamanistic, animistic cultures. And it's possible to honor that calling in a way that's still sensitive to and includes being a good ally to actual indigenous people. So,
and not being a spiritual tourist or...
Yeah, look, awkward white people crashing around trying to reclaim their spirituality, it's not necessarily a bad thing. Like, you want to try not to do harm with it, but the longing to reconnect with something authentic is important. And it comes out of a real sincere heartache for the cultural mess that we've arrived in.
And I think it's fair to say that there may be people that such a person would run into that is offended by it, and it's just, accept that they're where they're at and keep going kind of thing.
Take in the feedback, see if what is being expressed to you has merit, and understand what's meant by decolonization. Understand, what do people mean when they say they're anti-racist? What does it mean to be sensitive to issues around class or history of patriarchy and sexism? So do get educated, but don't let your internalized shame or tentativeness or low self-esteem stop you from crashing around and learning and connecting with teachers and communities. Yeah.
Okay. Every time you talk, I come up with 12 different questions, so I just kind of follow whatever thread. But there's another person on our group that is Veronique, who I think is very interested in chronic illness. So she said, I'd love to hear thoughts, experiences regarding chronic illness, autoimmune disease, chronic fatigue, and the like. Has he seen cures? Does he find it can take longer for those of us who are more syndromal? I don't know if that's a familiar concept.
Yeah.
Any tips that he's learned about working with this particular category of people with chronic illness?
Sure. Well, I want to be clear to not generalize or to claim it's too boldly a thing. But for folks with chronic illness or autoimmune conditions, one of the things that arises for me is, does this person have strong boundaries on a spirit level, on an energetic level? Because folks with those types of conditions often have a lot of constitutional water or empathic, boundary diffuse temperament. So it means they can be a sponge for other kinds of energies. And one of the big kinds of unhelpful energies that can be in a person's field are the ghosts, the troubled dead, the energies from one's ancestral lineages that are not yet at peace. And they, by virtue of being a not yet healed, out of place energy in this dimension, are drawing energy from the living. And so for anyone who would come to me or someone I've trained with symptoms of chronic illness or fatigue or autoimmune condition, a first priority would be helping them to know how to establish strong boundaries, not just in human relationships, but with the other than human world, the spirit world. And so to have strong, clear boundaries from the troubled dead and from their own family systems, and then to know how to draw in that place of being well-boundaried on sources of safe vitality, like connection to the earth, connection to the elemental powers, connection to their own inner light and sense of soul level purpose and destiny. So out with the intrusive energy, strengthening the core of connection to sources of spiritual vitality. That's step one. And then making sure that whatever vectors of ancestral toxicity or harm that they're being affected by get safely healed up. That can only help to complement whatever kinds of physical and kind of more medical treatments may also be supportive.
It's really interesting that you say that, because I think, who gets drawn to the therapy world are people who are pretty empathetic, empathic.
Sure.
And my recollection of our time together as interns was watching many different people succumb to chronic illness or fatigue.
Oh, yeah.
And these sorts of things.
We have a tremendous blind spot around the subtle energy or spirit level of things. And people associate even going there with religion or with some kind of new age thing that they're wary of. And look, it's not just religious stuff. It's not just new age stuff. It's a basic way of seeing the world that recognizes that what's physically perceivable is just part of the picture of what we are. And I remember doing kind of saging and space clearing at the agency where we both worked, because I was like, man, we have so many people coming in with so many things, and no one's ever just tending to the energetic hygiene of the space. And so that attunement to those levels of reality can be very important if you want to have sustainability as a therapist. And they're also important in just healing up if you're an empathic person who's taking on energy from systems around you. When someone is very symptomatic, it's often because they've been, not conscious to them usually, spiritually identified as the like repository of ancestral stuff in the family. Like they're the, I don't want to say scapegoat, but they're like the energetic sink, or the symptom bearer for the overall system. And so they can find the skills and support to transform the energies that are living within them. They can actually end up thriving, but there's a need to have support for that, and to work it on a systemic and ancestral lineage level to get at some of it.
Yeah, and I'm also thinking about, my friends with chronic illness that have an organic cause, but I would imagine that having this kind of temperament, or just the ancestral wounding, makes us more susceptible to disease. I mean, that's something that I'm learning from Gabor Mate and other people like that.
You think of it in terms of immune system health. If you have a compromised immune system, there's a whole litany of problems that you are now facing that you wouldn't have if your immune system were strong. It's like that with energetic boundaries and fortitude as well. So being surrounded by beneficial energies in spirit can, in a sense, it strengthens our, you say, energetic immune system, something like that.
And I think that if you ever wanted to do a webinar on that topic alone, there would be a lot of people. So maybe one of your students or something, if you don't have the time.
That's great. Yeah.
There was one more person that I told you about that you said was an important question. So I'm going to be clunky here and find it.
If I remember right, it was something like, if my family's a hot mess and my ancestors are not great people, well, go ahead if you have the question.
Yeah, I found it. Does working with a traumatized decedent have the potential to strengthen the traumatic attachment? Basically, I'd like to know how to clear oneself of the trauma energy without entrenching that energy, similar to exposure therapy with trauma survivors.
Yeah, in that 1 to 10 scale that I mentioned, at no point, whether someone's coming for just a session or someone's training in how to guide this for others, at no point am I asking anyone to relate with the dead who are not yet well directly. The methodology is to connect with those who are deeply well and safe and vital, and to ask them to do the healing for the dead who are not yet well. And so you connect with what's well and stay in that field of wellness the entire time, and call that energy around you, while asking them to metabolize and heal up any energies that are not yet well. So the concern is addressed by going directly to the more ancient, well-healed ancestors, not connecting with recent living family, unless they happen to be unusually at peace, which often is not the case. Yeah, so you go to the well energies, everything patterns out from there, and stay in that field of protection. Yeah.
So, and I guess maybe the last question is, knowing how someone was in life, does that necessarily mean that they...
It doesn't necessarily. Some people who are a real pain in life or acted in really harmful ways actually work things out upon death in a way that might feel unfair to a living person who still hasn't processed the harm that's occurred. And so there may be a sense that this person should be suffering because that feels just, because they harmed me. Well, they may not actually continue to suffer. And people may present as very well and very successful during life, and upon death, the front that they manicured of wellness is no longer tenable, and so the private suffering they worked with is what's more manifest, and they're struggling more than one might think. And so the dead change, just like us. And because of that, they can be more or less well than we might imagine. Our opinions of them are not the same as their actual condition. So it's important to have an open mind when coming to the work, because the way I'm approaching it, at least, it's not only working with how we view them, it's engaging how are they actually in spirit. Yeah.
So start somewhere and read the book.
Yeah, Ancestral Medicine is the book, of course, that's available, and then folks can just reach out with an email or something like that. My site is ancestralmedicine.org, and there's a lot of free resources there, and I'm happy to be an ally for those drawn to this work.
And you have a pretty lively Facebook group, too.
I do. If people want some opinions, they can connect with me on Facebook, too. Good.
Thank you so much.
Thanks,
that was
Brandy.
awesome.
Yeah, great.